Hi, this is Catherine, and welcome back to Taking Tea with Catherine. I'm drinking, once again, peppermint tea, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think it is so good, delicious, enjoyable, it's got nuances, and it's so good for me, and good for a lot of people. And I think the same thing can be said for nonfiction. Even though some people think, oh, that's so boring, why would you want that? You know what? It's not. So, it's Nonfiction November, and I think that we who are participating in Nonfiction November want to really encourage people to read it. This whole nonfiction thing that some people don't read and they don't get it, and of course you want to encourage people to get into it. So Olive, over at a Book Olive, who is hosting this Nonfiction November, is someone who really does know how to get people into nonfiction, I think. Um, and she's come up with a new tag called Nonfiction on Booktube Tag. There is such a thing as nonfiction on Booktube. Yes, I have found quite a few people that I like to watch. Maybe they don't read only nonfiction, neither do I, but when they do, they have a lot to say, and I think it's great, so I'm glad that this tag has been created. So I'm going to get started. Number one, how much nonfiction do you read? And that varies, obviously, but if I were going to do a statistical math thing, which I'm not, but I would probably say there's a 50-50. And I really do like nonfiction, so I would say I like reading novels and stuff, but I also really like nonfiction, so yeah, probably 50-50. And sometimes 70-30 and sometimes 30-70, depending on the time period. Number two, what kind of nonfiction videos do you make or do you want to make on Booktube? Well, I haven't really made any specifically, besides my TBR, nonfiction videos yet. I'm still quite new. I would love to just get into more themes of the type of nonfiction that I like history and, biography, etc. But really what I need to do, because this is Taking Tea with Catherine, is I really need to talk more about my tea books, and I really need to get started on that tea library tour. I have a whole, you can't see it from here, but down below this whole big hodgepodge of books, I have a lot of tea books, and it might take more than one video to go through all of them, but that's okay, because sometimes tours take time. And I just love to go down memory lane and all the books I've read about tea. So that's a goal. Number three, what's your favorite subgenre of nonfiction? And I like so many different kinds. It's really hard, and I've only seen 2 videos of this tag, and they pretty much said the same-ish thing. But I have to say, I really like biography, and I really like memoirs. I mean, I love history, and I love all kinds of other subjects, but that is probably what I gravitate toward the most with nonfiction. And there it is. Number 4, do you have a favorite nonfiction book? I don't know, because I have a hard time with favorites, and there's different reasons I like certain books more than others, and I will gravitate toward. But I'm just going to reach the one I read for fun the most often. It's short and sweet, but it talks about both New York and London, which are 2 of my favorite things. And yes, I've talked about this a number of times in this channel, but I'm not tired of 84 Charing Cross Road by Helene Hanff. I mean, it's not just Helene Hanff, it's letters between herself and Frank Doyle and other people working at Marks & Co. bookshop. But I really wish I could have gone to that bookshop. I just love reading about books, books about books. That's another subgenre that I love to read, but books about books can also encompass fiction, so I left that out this time. But it's also a great film, but this is just a great story, and it's not fiction. The film turns a few things into fiction, because that you do that, but this is what really happened. She assembled actual letters. So, and there's so many different books that I love, and it's really hard because I would like to show all kinds of books that are really, I call them my favorites. I'm just going to show you 2 more that are close to also favorites. Savage Beauty by Nancy Milford, about Edna St. Vincent Millay, who's also one of my very favorite poets. And it was just such a fascinating book. I could read it over and over again. I actually have to really read this again. and just the life was interesting, and the description of the life was interesting. The time period was cool. So yeah, very, very good book. And this is kind of, when I say it's one of my favorite nonfiction books, it's something that I've just referred to so many times when I got into like the British history and the lives of the kings and queens of England. Antonia Fraser, isn't it? Edited by Antonia Fraser, anyway. And I bought this in Gatwick Airport, I think, in 1999, when I was not much of a reader at the time. I'd read one or two books every once in a while, and then I'll get into this another time, but I really got into books first about Queen Victoria. I was reading novels, and then suddenly I wanted to know more, and this book was just such a great source to get into. And pre-internet, when I say pre-internet, internet existed, but I really didn't have much access to it, the late 90s. It was instead of Wikipedia or whatever, it was a great place to just go and read about English history as told through this medium. So yeah, that's I don't know, it's really hard for me to pick favorites. These are just a few of my favorite things. I'm singing again, stop me. Number 5. What do you think keeps people from wanting to read more nonfiction? I don't know. I've seen a lot of people say things like they think it's boring and, that it reminds them of school. And I think that is actually valid, totally true, and probably better than the reason I'm about to say. But when I think about it sometimes, I don't want to say ignorance because that sounds insulting, but I think it's a sort of unaware thing going on. When I say that, it's not like that people don't know about, say, biographies, or about history books, or about nature writing per se. If you ask them about it, they would say, oh yeah, that exists. But they don't consciously think about it as, if they're not readers, they just really probably don't think about it either way. But if they are readers, and they're just fiction readers, when they walk into a bookshop, for instance, that's probably what they're gravitating toward, is novels. And even though they may see nonfiction in the distance, they're not directed toward it. So that if they're not already guided toward it for any reason, they're just not really, wanting to read it. So, I don't know, that's just one of the reasons. It's not the only reason. Number 6, why do I like nonfiction? Well, I mean, it's kind of hard to explain without going on and on for a million years, but I've said this before, when I like something, I can't just say, oh, I like that. I have to know everything. I have to immerse myself in that subject, whether it's a person, not to sound stalkery, whether it's when I get into animal life or tea or a part of history, a city that I love like London, I have to know. I mean, there's occasionally that I'll just read one book about something and I'm good. But for the most part, I am the kind of person who needs to know the whole thing. And I want to get a hold of as much information as possible, and nonfiction books do that for me. Nonfiction books get into it more than just a little article, again, on Wikipedia or just Googling something. Not that I don't do that sometimes, but just everything about something and more. So, I don't know. I do know. I love it. I can't explain, but I did explain, so it's explained. The end. All right. Number 7. What's a nonfiction book that I read because of Booktube? Well then, like I said, I've been on Booktube as a booktuber. Now, is a booktuber someone who just makes videos, or someone who watches them as well? So if you're someone who watches them, I've only been really watching just for maybe a year and a half tops. But I've been on Booktube since the summer, or right before the summer. So I don't know how to qualify that. It might just going on and on. But so I'm just gonna narrow it down and say one book I've read and enjoyed is during Jane Austen July. One book that was recommended I ended up reading was Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley. And by the way, I've watched her documentaries before, and I don't know, for some reason I didn't realize that she wrote books. Somehow. Maybe I knew, but I didn't know. But when I read this book, I loved it so much, and now I want to read all of her books. I haven't yet, but I want to read all of her books. So that is one I've read because of Booktube. So there it is. I should have just said the book, right? I don't have to go on, but I do that. By the way, guys, if I'm rambling, there's a nice little feature that, I know I talk a little fast, but there's a nice feature that speeds up on YouTube someone talking. So if I'm a little going on a bit, I don't mind being, as long as you can understand me, you can forward me a little bit. Number 8. What's the best nonfiction book that I've read lately? And again, in the past few months, I've been not reading as much nonfiction because I've been in all these challenges. I had read a good one. Oh no, that's earlier this year. So maybe I'm gonna go down the rabbit hole if I go into the earlier this year when I was reading a lot. I read Trevor Noah's memoir, autobiography. Is it autobiography or memoir? Wow, I forgot the name of the book. Okay, so that was really good, despite forgetting the name of the book. I'll remember as soon as I turn this off. I do that. But I've mentioned this book recently, but I liked it. It's the second book in the bookseller series, I'm going to call it. It's Confessions of a Bookseller. It's, once again, basically a diary or a log of Mr. I can't pronounce his last name, Sean Bithell? I should know how to. Is he actually Scottish? I mean, he's in Scotland. But anyway, yes, he owns and works at a bookshop in Wigtown, which is a book town in Scotland. He's a bit of a grumpy cat, and I love that. And speaking of cat, he's right here. And and he writes about a cat as well. Not a lot, but it's just, I think it's fantastic and funny reading about the customers, reading about his life and his slight, I don't want to say misanthropic, but slightly, which is relatable. But he also loves books, so it was a great read. Well, Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. I could not remember that before. Oh boy, I really need to start editing these things. But anyway, but not today. Not today. I'm reading nonfiction books. I'm busy. Number 9. What are some of my nonfiction reading goals? And I have quite a few. There's a lot of subjects I want to read deeper on. I want to read more Lucy Worsley, for instance. But I think the big one, and this has been my thing for a long time, behind me you see a lot of books, both non and fiction. And I have even more books in my TBR that are either reads or rereads, but mostly to read, which is sad because there's so much of it. And a lot of them are nonfiction, and I want to read a lot of those books. So that's a goal. Number 10. What is my advice for incorporating more nonfiction into my reading diet? Not my reading diet. I read a lot. But for people who read, but don't read a lot of nonfiction, or people who don't really read, but want to read, and sometimes, weirdly enough, people who don't read that much will only read nonfiction. So, weirdly enough. But I would say, what do you like to do? Now, people love to do all kinds of things. So, you can go into that. You can say, read more about your interest. But that's already been said by a number of people, although it's totally right, totally true. I'm also going to expound on what people really like to do, most people, including myself, is watch television. So many people watching television. Many people watch films too. So that you can incorporate that here too, but I'm just going to say television because that's what I thought about more. People like to watch things on network TV. People like to stream things, binge watch. So many different TV programs out there. I'm trying not to watch as much television as I used to. But, so read something that corresponds with a TV show that you like. So, all these food shows, these angry chefs, whatever they call it, or these baking shows, these contests and everything. So, if you're into that, you might be into food memoir. You might be into travel shows that are mostly, travel books that are mostly about food. And there's so many of them. Just look in your bookshop or online, but look in your bookshop. Go to your bookshop and just browse. Go to the nonfiction sections. Go to that interest. Go to, oh, I like this TV show, and look, this book is kind of about that. Sometimes even recipe books. You know, there's books about restaurants. I have a few of them that I might end up showing in my tea library tours. But like, for instance, Tea and Sympathy. They, one of my favorite British restaurants in New York, and although I've had my ups and downs with them this year, but I think I mentioned them in a video recently, but about 15, maybe more than 15 now, years ago, one of the waitresses, I guess you can call it, staff, I don't know, she wrote a book about her life and about the people going to this restaurant, and also incorporated recipes, so it's helpful. That's fantastic. You feel like you're at this restaurant, and it's almost better than a TV show. Actually, it is better than a TV show. Come on. And plus, especially because sometimes you read these things that happened recently, and you can go to the restaurant and see the people. So it's like, it's easier than meeting a lot of people on television, right? I don't know. I love Doctor Who. I haven't watched that much recently just because, but I do still love Doctor Who very much, and although you can argue that a lot of people who like Doctor Who are into sci-fi, so they may be more into sci-fi novels, but there's a whole aspect of going back in time where they meet historical figures. Some wonderful ones recently, like Rosa Parks, even like King James of Scotland/England, and of course Vincent van Gogh, that legendary episode from about 9 years ago now, where they meet Vincent van Gogh, and it's a very emotional episode. You watch that, and maybe you liked Van Gogh before. I say Van Gogh because I'm American. And maybe you didn't, but maybe you just got moved by what happened in that episode. And now you want to know more about this artist. There's so many great books about him. Some of them are huge, and some of them are not so big. Look for them. Read a biography. I'm telling you, he was interesting. Freaky, but interesting. But, art, You like comedy? You like watching stand-up comedy? You like watching sitcoms? So many of these comedians on Saturday Night Live, on these sitcoms, whatever, have written memoirs. And a lot of them are funny. I liked Bossy Pants by Tina Fey. I like some of Jim Gaffigan's books. Mindy Kaling wrote, I think, a couple of them, and the list goes on. That's just American. Right? There's no Canadians in there, were there? But anyway, so that's another option. And they're nonfiction, usually. I'm not that into, like, crime shows, but there's so many interesting ones. There's the procedural ones, like, I don't know, like Criminal Minds. And then there's, like, the Dateline, true crime stuff. Well, there's true crime books in the bookshop. And they're a little depressing, but they're good. And there's not just recent true crime. There's historical crimes. People like to read about Jack the Ripper. That's not my thing, but people do, So, and that just goes on and on. Downton Abbey, there's been books about the time period, books from the people who live at the castle. Highclere Castle. You know what I mean? You like The Crown? Because I like The Crown. There's books about Queen Elizabeth II and other people around her, the Windsors, etc. I mean, so many options. I sound like I'm angry. I'm like, so many options. But it's just because I'm like, read. There's so much to choose from, and it's so good. As good, if not better, than fiction. Awesome. Often. And, but I still love fiction. You know that. So, a bonus. And I like taking on a bonus. Give some recommendations of non-fiction booktube channels that I love. Obviously, Olive from over at a book. Olive, but that's, obviously. And Steve Donahue, who is quite prolific as a booktuber, as a reader, etc. And, I mean, if anyone knows a lot about nonfiction, dude. I really love Jennifer Brooks. She is really into history and a lot into English history, which is my thing. So it is rare that I've seen someone speak so enthusiastically about that part of history that I love so much. And the Saxon kings, which, Anglo-Saxon history that I know only a little bit about. She's gotten me interested in. Now I'm about to read a book about Alfred the Great. Well, maybe not about to, but hopefully soon. Um, and the Wars of the Roses she likes to read about. The Borgias, you know. I mean, and like in such a fun, happy, book nerdy way, which I love. I say nerd in a good way, okay? The history shelf is one I found recently. Very, very enthusiastic and very knowledgeable about history. So I'm gonna try to link everybody down below. And I hope you guys have enjoyed my little, it's not my tag, but the answers to the tag. And I hope if you haven't been reading nonfiction, I hope that you take some of these suggestions. Um, and I hope you are really enjoying Nonfiction November, because it's only early days, but I am so far. And just find a book. Find one book that's nonfiction this month. Even if you read no nonfiction, find one that's you're into an interest. You will not regret it, and if you do, what can I say? This is Catherine from Taking Tea with Catherine. Have a lovely, lovely day.